Hi everyone, my name is Kolya Rice. I'm the instructor for Art History 270, Identity, Politics, Issues of Representation in Contemporary Art. Or another way to phrase that without that title would be to say that this is a course that is about artists who have been working since the 1960s on questions about how, in particular, minority cultures, so this might mean women, this might mean people of color, have been represented by majority cultures in ways that either perpetuate or extend inequities that have deep historical roots to them, and that these artists are involved in both providing alternative representations for their cultures as well as contesting some of the ways that these cultures have been represented by the majority cultures. It's one of the key themes in art since, in particular, even though it goes back to the 1960s, in particular of the late 80s through the 90s and the contemporary day. So it's a very, very rich area of study. Now, hopefully at this stage you have all received the introductory email that I sent out. If you have not looked at that yet, or it got lost in your spam or something like that, please just pause this lecture right now. Go find that introductory email. If you can't find it in your email, it is also posted as the first announcement for this class, which, let me just pause there and say, if you haven't already turned on your notifications on Canvas for announcements, please do. I will be sending out announcements weekly, if not more so, kind of giving you a little bit more guidance on what's coming up for the weekly assignments and so forth. And it's something that you want to be notified about so that you don't have to every time kind of go to Canvas to look at the announcements. In any case, if you haven't already seen that, please pause and go find that, go look at the syllabus, take a gander at them, and then return to this lecture. If you have already seen them, then what we're doing here is kind of like what you would do on the first day of a face-to-face class, which is you'd come in, the instructor would hand out the syllabus, and you'd go over the basics of the syllabus. They would ask if you have any questions, which I will ask as well. And you can ask those questions through emails or we'll have a Zoom meeting open to anyone who wants to come in the first week, and more Zoom meetings if they're beneficial to people on a weekly basis, just based upon your own interest and whether that's useful to you. In the introductory email, before I get started on kind of going over the basics of the syllabus and what this course is all about and what your requirements are, I asked you to post a bio. I asked you first to spend some time thinking about identity, your own personal identity, how you think of yourself, how you represent yourself to others, why this is important to you and so forth, or why certain values are important to you and so forth. And then I asked you to take that thing that you did, that list you made in private, and to determine what you're willing to share with the rest of your peers for this class. And I think it's only fair that I give you a little bit of a sense of who I am and why these issues are important to me. So, as you can probably tell, I'm a white male. I want to start there because, as many of you know, for a very, very long time, whiteness wasn't named, right? It just was the neutral term in the world. You didn't name it. You might name other races or ethnicities, especially in the West, as others, but whiteness was always just kind of this neutral term, and I don't want it to be that here. There are reasons that you need to mark whiteness. The first one is, and this might rankle some of you, but it's, the way that this course is set up to ask these questions. Whiteness is a privilege in the West, right? Whiteness is a privilege in the United States. Being a white male, heterosexual, cisgendered male, that is, me, I have a lot of privilege. What does this mean? And again, I go into these in the lectures themselves. A lot of people get really rankled by this, right? I'm not privileged, right? I had to work really hard for what I achieved. That's not what we mean by privilege. Of course you had to work hard for what you achieved. All privilege means is the place that I started off as a white man who is heterosexual and cisgendered benefits me in ways that if I were not a white man, I was a person of color, or I wasn't a man, I was a woman, or if my gender was transgender rather than cis, or if I were homosexual, I wouldn't have the same benefits. That's all privilege means. Doesn't mean you didn't work for what you achieved. It means that you were benefited because the way society is structured in ways that other people weren't. And this course is primarily about some of the ways that whiteness in our Western culture has dominated and subjected, and sometimes, more often than not, probably misrepresented minority cultures, and what artists have done to question these things. One of the areas that I studied as a doctoral student was these questions. They came to me early on because I have a rather odd family dynamic. I was raised in a very white family. My parents are both white, but my siblings, my sister Chloe and my brother Enan, were both adopted as infants. And my sister Chloe is Delwamish and Tlingit, so what we would call Native American or American Indian or an indigenous person. And my brother Enan is a black man. One of the reasons I want to bring that up is to say that let me put it this way. Sometimes people hear that, and I've always been really suspect of ever even announcing it, because I think they think that I'm virtue signaling, right? This term that's used today to say, hey, because I have people of color in my family, I somehow might not be racist, or I somehow might be more reflective of these things, or somehow I know their experience. And what I want to say to you is, that's not true at all. I know it more than perhaps most people do. That having grown up with siblings who are people of color, all of that's shown me is that, I don't have their experience. That never was racism directed at me, right? Even indirectly at me, because I am not a person of color. Or another way to put this is to say that while I grew up in proximity to some of these issues that we'll be talking about in this class, in other words, I saw racism directed towards my siblings. I was maybe particularly sensitive to racism around me because it hurt. It, extended to these people that I loved since they were kids. I also realized from a very early age that I was privileged not to have to deal with that, and that these things were wrong, and that they matter to me. I want to see them changed. I want to see these things go away if possible. I'd like to see, these things acknowledged at the very least in our world. And I'd like this class to be a forum in which we can exchange ideas about how that can get done by looking at artists and the ways that they have tackled these questions and reflecting upon how those strategies are beneficial in our lives and in our world. So the other thing about my kind of sense of self that I want to share with you is that if I've learned anything over now 20 plus years of teaching these subject areas and growing up in a multi-ethnic family, it's that I don't know everything, right? These are really complicated issues, and I do my best to share with you what I know, or what I think I know, what these artists are up to, what some of the most current kind of research and arguments are with these subjects, but I certainly know that I'm going to get it wrong from time to time, right? There's no way not to. It's just too difficult a territory not to get things wrong from time to time. When I teach this class face-to-face, it's pretty easy to get feedback from students. I think they feel a little bit more comfortable, in the moment saying, hey, have you thought about this idea that I encountered in this other class? Or people, some of my students of color will say, hey, you said this thing about black culture, but that's not my experience of things. And we can exchange those ideas without being judgmental, right? Without saying, Collier doesn't know what the heck he's talking about, or that's a really offensive idea. We can say that idea, offends me a bit, and here's why, without saying you're a bad person for saying that in the first place. And that's what I'd like to foster in this class. That's very important to me. Going beyond that, if I were to tell you, some of the values that I hold dear, one of them is empathy, another is kindness, and another is, really having a willingness to admit and reflect upon some of the things that, you've grown up believing that end up being problematic. If there's one thing that I've learned over the years, it's that the more we kind of hold on to these ideas that we think are completely right in the face of, someone pointing out the ways that they're destructive to other people, the less we're willing to change, and the less benefit is extended to others that we might seek, to be allies with. Final thing is that while in this online course you'll probably never see this, I'm a total introvert. I am not interested in a lot of sociality, or I have a very small group of very intimate friends, but I don't seek out I'm not the social butterfly whatsoever. And sometimes when students see me in a face-to-face class, they can't believe this could be true, because one of my personas, of course, is to stand up in front of hundreds of people and give lectures. But that's just a persona, right? That's just one aspect of me that, frankly, I had to work a lot to cultivate, and it's not really who I am. Well, that's plenty, I suppose, and maybe more than you wanted to know about me, but I thought it was important to give you a sense of why these things are important to me, where I'm coming from, and to really acknowledge that I'm here to learn from you as much as I can, and I have learned a ton from my students over the years in ways that I'm very thankful for. So don't hesitate in a respectful way to offer constructive feedback to me and to your peers over the course of this quarter. So then on to the specifics of the syllabus then. If you need to contact me, more often than not, it's easiest for students to do so through email. I check my email several times a day. I can't promise you that I will respond to an email that I receive after 5 p.m., but I usually do. But, I'm trying to hold boundaries a little bit more, I suppose. So if you send me an email in the morning, I usually get to it within a couple of hours. If for any reason an email lingers and you haven't gotten a response in 24 hours, something's gone wrong, right? So send me that email again, absolutely, to let me know that I haven't responded to it. It's got lost in a spam or something like that. The other way that you can contact me is we can set up a Zoom appointment to talk to each other through Zoom. I will, as I said, in the first week, have a large kind of informational, drop-by session on Zoom that anyone who is available and interested can kind of stop in and say hi or ask any questions that you have. And if that is beneficial to you going forward in the course, we can set that up for multiple times over the course of the quarter. Otherwise, I have found more often than not that students tend to prefer, although every quarter it's a little bit different, individual sessions on Zoom if they need them. And again, every day of the week I am available. I have multiple hours available for Zoom appointments if that's something that you want. The course description, let's just read through this together. The course is designed to introduce you to various ways contemporary artists and art movements, primarily in the United States, have explored the intersection of visual representation, meaning arts, identity, whether that identity be gender, ethnic, racial, sexual, or some kind of intersection of those, and politics, or the exercise of power. which is one of the most persistent themes in art since the 1960s. You will work your way through sequences of materials and assignments organized into weekly modules on Canvas. It's an asynchronous course, so every week you will have 1 or 2 modules. In fact, I think the only week that you have 2 modules is in the first week, so the rest you'll just have 1 module, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with Canvas by now, but a module is just an organizational grouping. So it's just a way for me to say in week 1, you have a module which has various different assignments and content in it. And you get to work your way through those over the course of the week at your own pace, right? So all of our lectures are recorded. All of the readings are up there as PDFs. When you have assignments, which I'll get to in a minute, you'll have multiple days to complete those assignments, and you can work through them at your own pace, as I said. You'll never need to be online at exactly the same time period as the rest of your peers, so you get to do this, again, as it fits your schedule. Modules open no later than the Monday of the week in question. Every time that it's possible for me to do so, I will actually open a module on the Friday of the week before the assignments. And that's just to give you an extra weekend to look over it if you want. You don't need to. You can just ignore it till Monday if you want to. But again, anytime I can do that, I will. Once I open a module, it will remain open for the remainder of the quarter, so you can always return to it if you need to. Let's say you're coming up on a writing assignment, you want to refresh your memory about something, or you're coming up upon a quiz and you want to return to a lecture or to a reading, it will be open to you. Course content, so all of the content of this course will be delivered either through Panopto video lectures, such as this one, or readings. In this course, we don't have a textbook. It would be awesome if there was one textbook that did everything that I wanted it to do, because that would coordinate things and create a kind of thread narrative through the different topics that we would be dealing with. But the types of texts that might be available for this course, and I've copied some of the readings from texts like that, aren't good enough for the depth of knowledge that I want to have in this course. So instead of having a textbook, you have PDF files of special topic readings that are available on Canvas in the individual modules. And I'll get to that and show you that in a minute. But again, you'll just go to the module and click on the little file, and it'll show up in your browser, and you can download that if you want, or you can just read it through Canvas. So you will be, again, getting content through either lectures from me or through these coordinated readings, where you will explore how artists have contested dominant representations of gender, sexuality, race, or ethnicity, as well as other minority subjectivities or identities. Subjectivity is a course we'll get to in due time. It's another kind of fancier term for a particular model of how to think about identity, and how artists have proposed alternatives for the representation of these constituencies. We will have online discussion forums, reflective papers on readings, and online quizzes, and a couple of other minor assignments that have been designed to engage you with these topics, foster creative and critical thinking, and in particular to allow dialogue concerning the stakes involved in visual representations, and to allow me to assess your evaluation and progress over the course of the quarter. Your responsibilities. The big one is almost equally spaced over the course of the quarter are 3 quizzes. The first one doesn't come until week number 5, and I give you lots of time to do these quizzes, a full week. They are essay-based questions. There are fewer short answers than I once used in this class, and you'll basically be being asked to summarize and synthesize lecture and reading materials on that period. They can be substantial, and that's why I give you, in the first quiz, you'll have an entire week with no content on it to complete the quiz. And again, they're each worth 15% of your grade, and together they make up 45% of your grade. They will all be graded on a 100-point scale. Almost every week, although not on weeks where you have quizzes and sometimes I give you a break, you'll have what are called summary reflective essays on the reading and lecture assignments. This is to ensure that participants in this course have a strong comprehension of the key ideas from the course readings and to allow me to offer feedback to you on the content of the course. So I will always provide you, when it comes to reflective essays, with a very detailed prompt about what I want, oftentimes a rubric for what your paper should have in it. All of the readings will have reading guides with them as well as an introductory video to the readings, so that I can say, hey, week number 2, here are your readings. This is what this reading is really about. This is what I really want you to focus on. And that should help guide you towards being successful on these summary reflective essays. They're all graded on a 10-point scale. And then just about every week again, although on, again, the weeks of quizzes, oftentimes you won't have these, you will be required to participate in weekly discussion forums. The topics of this course really lend themselves to rich discussion and manifold perspectives. Candidly, sometimes in an online course, it can be difficult to generate a discussion, but I have found, in particular in this course, that the discussions are amazing. They are really thoughtful and reflective and informative in ways that other courses sometimes struggle to get to that level. These are difficult topics in this course, and you're going to have lots of different feelings about the topics of this course and perspectives on the topics of these course. And things that will be said in discussions might rankle you. They might frustrate you. They might even anger you from time to time. That's okay, right? But please respond to each other respectfully, so that if someone really bothers you with what they post, it's perfectly okay to say to that person, hey, when you said this, it makes me think about this, and I feel like you're coming at it from this point of view, and correct me if I'm wrong, but here's what I think you're getting at, and here's why it bugs me, right? Don't say, you're a total idiot, and I don't ever want to hear such a racist comment again, even if you think, even if that's your initial response. It's very important for us, especially in our contemporary climate, to hear each other, to be able to share our views and learn from each other, rather than just polarize ourselves into our own separate quarters again. Yeah. So with discussion forums, when you have these, you must post an initial post by Wednesdays at midnight. Right? So you'll see a prompt, it'll say, hey, here's our discussion topic for this week. By Wednesday of that week, you post your initial response, and then you're required to make at least one response to appear by Friday at midnight. This gives you then time early in the week to read over the content and view the lectures, think about them a little, and compose an initial discussion post, and then spend some time reading over the posts of your peers and responding to at least one of them. You can respond to more than one. So how can you be successful in the discussions? Well, the first thing is that I'm always looking for discussion posts that are informed by the course materials, as well as your own thinking and reflection on these. So that, for instance, if you post a question that has already been thoroughly answered in the lecture, I will presume that you didn't really view the lecture, right? If you post a question that has already been posted, 3 or 4 times in the discussion forum before you've posted yours, I'll think this person hasn't bothered to read over the discussion so far and to post another productive question in there. In other words, I'm looking for you to be engaged. I'm looking for you to be informed. And as long as you are engaged and informed and really doing that work, you'll get full credit on these, right? So finally, I want to say this about the discussion posts. It's really useful for you to explain yourself in detail when you make a post, right? So don't presume that everyone knows exactly what you're talking about. If you're asking a question, and this is part of the prompt, which you'll see when you go on Canvas, the general prompt for all discussions, really explain yourself. Say, hey, here's the question I have. Here's why I'm asking this question. This is what I hope to gain from you in asking this question, and so forth. They should be substantial entries. And then when you answer a post or you respond to a post, it's really easy for me to see when someone's like, I really don't have time this week for the discussion. I'm just going to say, hey, that's a really great idea. I think the same way too. That's not good enough. We really want to generate a thorough discussion. So a response to the post might be to extend it. It might be to counter it. It's always something that should be engaged and show that you've put in some thought, right? And if you do that, you'll get full credit. Summary reflection essays make up, 35% of your grade. The other percentage of your grade is made up of these weekly discussions, which is a substantial 20% of your grade. Again, you'll post your initial post by Wednesday midnight and your response to appear by Friday midnight. All of your essays will be run, as many of you know, through VeriCite, which is an anti-plagiarism software. You do not need to cite anything in this course if you are drawing from the course materials themselves. In other words, if you are taking a course reading and using it in your quiz, you don't need to say, hey, I took this from this particular reading. Don't need to cite it. If you draw from sources outside of this course, which I do not recommend at all, don't really want that. But let's say you had a really great reading in another class and you want to bring that in to this class, and it's really important to you, you do need to cite that. Please do not mess around with this. Plagiarism is a problem. It's especially a problem online. It's really easy to detect these days. You will get a report from VeriCite that says, for instance, after you post it, immediately, hey, only 5% of your essay has other sources out there in the world, or you'll get something every once in a while, someone will turn in a paper that's got like 60% of what is in their essay can be found online somewhere or in the repositories of Canvas from previous courses. It checks against all of that. And if you get caught plagiarizing, it is my required responsibility to report you to the University of Washington, where you'll have to have a meeting with people and it goes on your permanent record. So just don't do it. It's not worth it, right? And if you have any questions about what plagiarism is, just follow the link here or ask me. But again, if you're just drawing from this course, you don't need to cite it. If you're drawing from my lectures, that's expected. You don't need to cite that. But if you pull things from outside of this course, you're absolutely going to need to cite that. So then, the final thing I want to talk to you about just very briefly is what the topics of this course are. And I want to say right off the bat that in a course, just one quarter course that is trying to deal with, again, various different minority groups and the art that they have produced in order to either contest majority representations of them or offer alternative views or raise issues about various inequities in the world, I can't cover it all. There would be no way for me to cover every single minority group that you could who have incredible artists producing incredibly interesting work, right? So I had to make a number of decisions in this course. And one of the big ones that I think is a tough one for a lot of people to buy into is that the first week is an introduction to the topics, and it introduces these topics through gender, in particular the way that women have been represented historically and what some of the problems with that is. So it starts with a very broad category, gender, which I think can appeal to at least, I mean, if I'm being generous, at least, right, 50+% of the population who are a gendered population, women, who might say, hey, that's an interesting topic. And for most of the men, they're like, oh, that's an interesting way to think about things. The other reason that we'll focus in the first, it's basically 3.5 weeks on gender, and in particular on white women, which again is something that I think a lot of people of color, and frankly these are primarily cisgendered artists, and so a lot of people who are transgender, or frankly people who are not, because most of these artists are also heterosexual or not heterosexual, have a problem with is it's like, why are you devoting so much time to white women? Why don't we spend more time on other groups? And I hear you. I understand that. And here's my explanation for this. The first major prominent artists or groups of artists in the United States to tackle these questions were women artists. And this course sets itself up chronologically, at least at the start. So dealing with this historically, if I look to the 60s, yes, there are Asian American artists, there are Asian artists producing in the United States, such as Yoko Ono or Shigeko Kubota, two artists that we'll be dealing with in this class. But the vast majority of artists were, again, white, women artists. So historically, based upon that, we're focusing on that. The second big reason is there's a trajectory in the first 3+ weeks of this course in which we set foundations for the contesting of representations of gender in this case, and asking questions and looking at strategies that artists have employed to contest and deconstruct and offer alternatives that then sets a foundation that we can move on from to other groups of artists. Or another way to put this is, while the subject matter is white women artists in the first, again, about 3.5 weeks, the topics and the basic kind of foundations that we're laying are things that are applicable to multiple different groups of artists. And so I guess the way that I want to say this is, when I go through the first 4 weeks, I'm able to get to some kind of standard questions that arise in a lot of different, issues associated with what we call identity politics through white women artists as part of kind of the historical trajectory of feminism that then can be applied to other groups. And so I, for instance, move from early, or what we call first generation feminist artists, then to activist arts on the West Coast, and then to what we call second generation feminist artists, all primarily white artists, although not exclusively. There's plenty of people of color in there as well, but their art's not really about that, in order to lay some foundations. That then we move in week number 5 and 6 and beyond to the intersections of gender and race or ethnicity, to issues that have to do with artists dealing with sexuality and so forth. So the other thing, though, and I'm going to take you through this, is, again, I'm going to be dealing with, well, actually, let me just put it this way. Let's go through it step by step, right? So if you're looking at my syllabus here, in the first week, you see, here's our outline. Week number 1, module number 1, just follow my cursor over here on the left. You're in module number 1 in the introduction to the course and overview. You see below that, and I always structure this exactly the same so that you get familiar with the structure of the course. Your assignments, you have this Panopto video lecture and intro, and then you have a discussion forum in which you've been asked to write a brief personal bio and reflection on your sense of your own identity and post that on Canvas. Always you'll see an assignment here, but the specific prompts for the assignments will be found on Canvas. And then in module 2, which is your next module, you see the first content-based lecture, which is on problems in the field of representation, and it's an overview of how women and femininity have been represented historically in Western culture, with, again, assignments, your Panopto video lecture, and a reading summary reflection. The readings. This first group of readings, and I won't do this for the entire syllabus because every week you'll have a video introduction to the lecture, or I'm sorry, the readings and you'll also have a reading guide for those readings. But in this one, I want to alert you to some things because it's the oddest of the bunch when it comes to readings, and it feels like a lot, and I get that. These are primarily kind of setup readings. They're things that are meant to get you thinking about these issues. So the very first reading, Brian Wallace's excerpt from What is Wrong with This Picture and Introduction, is a reading that's primarily about what we mean when we say representation, a representation of something, right? So another way to put this is, just to get you thinking about this, I can say, something happens to me during the day, and then I tell that story to someone else, or in this case, I make a picture of that to someone else, and I say, here's what happens. That story or that picture is a representation of an actual occurrence or an actual experience or an actual, something, right? It's represented. Why is that important? Because everything that's a representation comes from a very particular perspective, and that perspective is oftentimes shot through with our own ideological assumptions about the world. The second reading is a reading from John Berger from the 70s, basically during the height of, what today we might call third wave feminism. But it's really about the question of how women have been represented historically in Western art, and even more specifically through the tradition of the female nude. And even though it's dated in its language, and by the way, if you really want to see something funny, look at the video that I post on Canvas of John Berger kind of reading through his thoughts. It's very 70s disco. It's a really good foundational reading for thinking about how the traditions of art have represented what women should be, what is to be valued about art. And these are reflections of the ideological assumptions of their time. Sometimes people read the Berger reading and they think that Berger's advocating for this view of women. He's not. He's trying to show you historically how women have been represented in some of the problems of basically objectifying women for, according to male desire. The third reading of the first week is Gene Robertson and Craig Mcdaniel's Identity. This can be scary to a lot of people because there's a lot going on in that reading. It's almost like a grand overview of the quarter. You will never be tested on this. There may be a whole host of things that are in that reading that you think, I don't really know what he's talking about here. But I think it's useful to read through that and just start the wheels turning. Really just start thinking about identity in relation to art. The final reading isn't really a reading at all. It's meant to be a source for you. It's key terms from David Macy's The Penguin Dictionary of Critical Theory. There are a lot of special terminology in this course that some of you will be quite familiar with and others may be coming across it for the first time. Rather than have you kind of go Google search a term where you may or may not get an accurate definition, at least accurate in terms of how it applies to this class, this source can help kind of let you know, what I want you to know about those terms. So let's say you come across a term like deconstruction or something like that, and you're like, I kind of know what that means, but it would be helpful to know more what is meant by this. You can always turn to this source. Now, most of those key terms, the ones that I really want you to know, I will bring up and explain in lecture. It's just meant to be another source for you. Then just about every week you have optional readings. They are exactly what they sound like, optional. If you get really interested in a topic, you might want to go at those optional readings if you have time, just to get a little bit more information on that topic. Week number 2, we deal with first generation feminism. This is one of the toughest things in this course. First generation feminist art in the United States is not the same as waves of feminism. I know it's a pain in the butt for me too, but most of you know there are historical waves of feminism that don't have anything necessarily to do with the arts. Like the first wave of feminism starts, you can place it in the 19th century. It can even be placed a little bit before that, where women are advocating for basic rights, right? Things like owning property, being able to divorce their husbands, and being able, in particular, to vote, right? So that's first wave. First generation feminism is actually coextensive with what we call the second wave of feminism. Again, I hate to confuse you so much right here, but just don't mix those terms up. When we talk about the first generation of feminist arts, what we're talking about is the first self-conscious feminist artists in the United States, right? These are artists primarily who started in the 60s or 70s and continue to produce, some of them even up until the last decade or so, who were the first groups of very self-conscious feminist artists who are using their art to draw attention to issues that they faced as women. So that's our week number 2. We focus on that. In week number 3, then, we go on to look at first generation feminist arts on the West Coast, and we look at it's more of a kind of case study. We look at West Coast feminism in terms of the feminist art program at ArtH and big projects that were completed under these artists. And we look at activist feminist arts, which are about picking a particular issue. In the case of our major artist here, who is Suzanne Lacey, things like, sexual violence against women, and really creating works of art that are meant to deal with those issues themselves. This is a part that I should probably pause and say, as you might imagine, in this course, there are a lot of triggers for a lot of people. And every once in a while, well, not every once in a while, just about every quarter, I get requests from students for trigger warnings, right? You should let us know when this or that is coming up. The whole class there's a big trigger warning all the way through, but I do have little warnings before the lectures, not in the lectures themselves, but before the lectures, that say things like, for instance, in the first generation of feminist arts, you look at an artist by the name of Ana Mendieta, and she has a really, really visceral work that's about rape and sexual violence. And I'll tell you, again, in a little caption before you view the lecture, around this point, when you go into Ana Mendieta, be aware there's going to be some very graphic images that have to do with sexual violence against women. And that's the best that I can do to kind of alert you to that. But I don't know everyone's triggers. And frankly, if I was going through and captioning every possible trigger, that's the whole class would be just one big kind of trigger warning, frankly, because some people are really offended by nudity. And that might be you. There's a lot of nudity in this class, and if I pointed out every place that you're going to see a nude woman or a nude man or some kind of graphic representation of homoeroticism or something, it would just be one big captioning thing. But the big ones that I'm aware of, the ones that I know over and again are really tough for students, I will caption before the video. It'll be in Panopta, and it'll say, hey, when you come to this artist, be aware you're going to see something pretty graphic here. And frankly, if it's something that's traumatic for you and you don't want to view it, and you say, hey, you warned me on this and I just can't see this because it's too tough for me, just send me an email that says, I don't want to look at this. You don't have to. I absolutely do not want to traumatize anyone in this class. And so, just let me know if you're going to take a pass on one or more of these topics. But I'm not going to trigger warn everything here. Okay, so then in week number 4, this is the week right before the quiz, we shift gears and we move into what is known as second generation feminism in the United States. And there's a big distinction, and we'll go into this in the lectures, but the big one is in the first generation of feminist artists, most of the artists associated with that movement wanted to revalue and redefine how women had been defined under patriarchy, to make it more nuanced, to make it more compelling, to make it more valuable in the world. They tended to, in the first generation of feminist arts, and these are arts of the 60s and 70s primarily, although it keeps flowing, to adopt some of the essentialized ways that women have been thought of. And we'll go into this in detail. The second generation of feminist artists who come of age in the late 70s into the 80s and 90s and continue to produce today were artists who adopted ideas from, in particular, French post-structuralist thought to conceive of identity, or what now became known as subjectivity, and women as a construct, that it wasn't something essential, that you weren't born in the world, and if you were a woman with a certain biology, you were going to be better at nurturing people, you were going to be more devoted to spirituality, you're going to be better at crafts and whatever it might be. These women of the second generation thought of gender as a construct, a very complicated construct, which we'll go into in detail. And they use their art to draw attention to this and to contest or deconstruct these constructs of gender. Week number 5 is a recap. It's just a kind of pause before we move forward with more intersectional senses of identity, and gives you a good full week to work on your quiz. When we return in week number 6, we tackle the topic of race. Now, I want to say here something about the terminology in this class. I will oftentimes use 3 or 4 different terms. For instance, here, Black or African American women in week number 6. And I will explain why I'm using those terms in the lectures, in the lectures themselves, but I want to give you some sense of them here as well. Race itself, and as you'll see, I'll go back and forth between race and ethnicity, is something some of you are probably aware of as a contested category these days. When I was growing up, I think it was pretty common for everyone to believe that race was basically a scientific category, that there are really discrete different races with very discrete different characteristics. And it turns out that that's really not true, that race is as much as of a construct as anything else, in that absolutely there are things like skin pigmentation or physiognomical differences between different people that are a product of their genetics. But when you really start looking closely at it, there aren't discrete different races. I mean, it's a big kind of fluid continuum more than anything else. And so oftentimes you'll hear people use the term race, but it's almost like it's in scare quotes, and that's how I want you to think of it in this class as well, as if race and ethnicity, or one's ethnic traditions, one's connections to a shared history or a common experience, are probably more important than any kind of genetic or physiognomic differences, even though those are used here. So Black, then, is kind of the preferred term these days. But again, it depends on who you're talking to. Some people prefer to be called African American, which is the more kind of, that's the way that for legal purposes, people who are of a Negro race are referred to. And so I put them both in there, knowing that they both have limitations. So in week number 6, then, we watch how some Black women artists who are feminists stood up and said, hey, wait a minute here, white ladies, don't speak for us, right? In other words, we start talking about identity as intersectional, that these women were multiply discriminated against for their sex or gender and their race or ethnicity. In other words, they had to deal with being a Black woman and the ways that they were discriminated against, the issues that they faced, as they pointed out in their art and in their essays and in their performances, couldn't easily be collapsed into just a gender, right? So white women's issues might not be the same as a Black woman's issue. Another thing that I want to say here about intersectional identity is it's not just that you're discriminated against because you're Black and you're a woman. it's almost like there's a third term in there. You're a black woman, which carries with it its own prejudices, its own stereotypes, its own problems. So when we get to intersectional identity, and we all have some kind of intersections in our sense of self, things get a little bit more complex here. I also want to say that when we start talking about minority groups in terms of intersectional identity in particular, but any minority group, it's absolutely worth remembering that one voice does not talk for all people. It's really easy for us to think about this if you just think about, like, is there one white voice, like one white point of view that everyone falls in line with? No, of course not. And so while there are common experiences and common issues that these minority cultures face that we'll be looking at in these works of art, if that experience doesn't match up with yours and you think, hey, I'm a black person, I don't have that problem, that's because, of course, no minority culture is monolithic. Not all people think the same way, even if they are members of a certain kind of loosely grouped constituency. In week number 7, we move on to black male or African American male artists and ethnicity. We hadn't talked about, gender in terms of masculinity here, and of course, being a black male carries with it all kinds of issues in this world that these artists are going to confront. Then we move on to LGBTQ arts in the United States, although I want to say here that this is a huge topic, of course. I am going to be focused primarily upon a moment in time in the late 80s, early 90s, where a number of, in particular, and this is, I think, important as well to point out, gay and lesbian and trans artists, the term queer was just kind of on the horizon, it wasn't out there much yet, were interested in creating art to attack the way that the U.S. was dealing with the AIDS, HIV crisis. And I don't want you to think, and I'll say this again in the lecture, I don't want you to think that all LGBTQ arts are somehow, to be collapsed into this one moment. They're not. But this was the moment in time in which a whole host of artists who, again, gay and lesbian, trans, queer communities are not monolithic. Not all gay people think or are confronted with the same issues. But at this moment in time, in the face of, this major catastrophe for the gay and lesbian community, they came together around a kind of common cause, and it's a good kind of entry into some of the ways that they contested the way that people were, well, frankly, people's homophobia. So we deal with that in week number 8. In week number 9, we go at this question in a slightly different way. We look at a special topics kind of case study on the culture wars in the United States of the late 80s, early 90s, where the National Endowment for the Arts was defunded because, in particular, right-wing politicians connected the NEA with gay and lesbian culture in particular. And so we'll look at how that unfolded. And then in the final week, we will be looking at one group of contemporary Native American or American Indian, or today we might say indigenous peoples, art and post-colonialism. Now, I've picked artists here that are artists that represent one approach of Native American, contemporary Native American artists. There are many, many other approaches as well. But I find these artists very provocative and interesting. And again, a way to think about the terminology here, if you're wondering, well, isn't American Indian really outdated? Kinda, but it's the legal term. Native American is also problematic in a number of ways, and indigenous peoples is also, it's floated around more these days, but it's also got its own problems. When we say indigenous, we're really talking about, usually that's followed with the indigenous Tulalip peoples or indigenous Kwakwaka'wakw people or something more specific. You don't just say loosely all indigenous people. Or I'm probably going to get in trouble with a number of you, but I have a real problem with BIPOC these days, which is a more current term, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, because it kind of groups together a whole bunch of disparate people under one label. Yes, all these people face prejudice. Yes, there are prejudices based upon being colonized peoples. I understand that. But in particular, if we can be as specific as we can be with all of these groups, it helps us to think in terms of how these groups are not monolithic. They're not all the same. Not all people who are from Native American groups are facing the same issues, even if some of the issues are the same. In fact, you know, if you're wondering what would be the best term to use for Native American populations or American Indian or indigenous populations, ask any of them. And what they will say over and over again is, I'd like to be called by my tribal affiliation, if anything. So, you know, but that's a tough one. You can't kind of list those all out here. Anyway, hopefully that's a good kind of overview of the course, and it gives you a sense of what you're in for. Again, I can't cover it all. I would love to have an entire class on, you know, broadly speaking, Latinx or Hispanic culture or Mexican culture or Mexican American or South American culture as well. There are a whole host of things that are being done by, again, broadly speaking, the Latinx communities during this time period that are really, really interesting. Asian American communities as well. In particular, there's a whole host of things that have to do with, you know, all of the really horrible stereotypes that started cropping up around World War II and extended beyond that American Asian cultures have dealt with, particularly those that extend from Japanese ancestry. But we have to draw a line somewhere, and I want to go into depth on the choices that I've made so that you can take these ideas, hopefully, and some of the strategies that these artists have employed and some of the issues that are involved. And because we've gone into them in such depth, you can apply those to other groups of people in ways that will make your thinking about these other, you know, issues that face other minority groups that haven't been covered in this class more productive. Really think about these things in ways that, you know, wouldn't work if I just did a very broad survey of every single group that I could think of. We'd never go into much depth, and yeah, you'd have a familiarity, but you really wouldn't have, I think, the depth of knowledge that would allow you to apply the ideas that you come across in this class beyond the content of this class. The final thing I want to say here is that please remember what I started with, which is, I don't know it all. I'm going to get it wrong from time to time, at least in some people's minds. Some things might really sound interesting to you. Others you might find, you know, being problematic or really grating you. I think that's a good thing. I think college is a place, in fact, beyond college, we should have more places to exchange thoughtfully and reflectively and respectfully our ideas, share them with one another, not so that we can become more firmly ensconced in our own belief systems, but rather so that we can really think beyond our own prejudices. Now, I know a lot of people, again, tend to find that, tend to get a little defensive when I say something like, hey, we all have prejudices. But just stick with me for a minute in this final kind of moment. We do all have prejudices. That's the way the human mind works. The human mind is really adept at gathering knowledge and then extending that knowledge to new situations that it hasn't confronted yet to make sense of them. In other words, we are set up to prejudge things that we don't really know yet based upon past knowledge, right? That's what a prejudice is. So if I were to say to you, and quite honestly, that over the course of my life, I have seen in myself, even having, and that's a dumb thing to say, but having been, growing up in a family where I love my brother and I love my sister and I saw racism, and then I see racism in myself, right? I see prejudices in myself, and they're hard to face, but they're there because I am a product of a society in which these beliefs are propagated. I am a product of a society that I believe has some really profound and very difficult and incredibly problematic biases that are not oftentimes acknowledged. They are sometimes personal, oftentimes they are institutional, or things that are, unconscious biases, but they're all around us all the time. And if there's one thing that I would hope that this class allows us to do, is to recognize some of those things in ourselves and to be reflective about them so that we can continue to be vigilant about some of these prejudices that have so poorly represented and so destructively hurt so many people over the years. Anyway, I look forward to a very interesting and hopefully productive and informative quarter with you. If you have any questions about this, please let me know. Before I let you go, let me just show you briefly your Canvas page so that you know how these things are set up, and I can just kind of point some things out. This isn't what you'll see. This is my instructor's view, but it gives you a sense of some of the things that you'll see as I open these modules, right? So they're all listed in the same order. They tend to extend in the same kinds of ways, right? You'll have a weekly reading, then you'll have your content-based lectures, and then you'll have assignments. In the first week, you see here a frequently asked questions page. That's the place that I refer to in your introductory email that says, hey, if you've got a question, the answer to which might be beneficial to other students in the class, post it there, right? And then as you go into these, if you go into a reading page and you open that up, you'll see that in the reading page, you've got, in this case, a video introduction to that page, and then you've got a reading guide. Then you've got the readings themselves that are all PDF files that if you click on them will take you to those readings. Then oftentimes you have optional readings or sometimes extra materials that may or may not be of interest to you. All right, I think that's enough. Let me know if you have any questions. And again, I look forward to a very interesting quarter with you.